So let's talk about analyzing an argument. So let's say you've read something and it proposes an argument, right? It has a thesis and an argument to support that thesis. It gives reasons for the thesis. You want to analyze it. What is analyzing it? It's a fancy word for thinking about it, considering it, breaking it down, responding to it. So how are we going to analyze an argument? Let's break it down. Let's break it down in terms of some questions we can ask. So first, let's ask, what claim is the text making? So that's the thesis, right? What thesis are they arguing for? Can you summarize that in a sentence? What's that main point? We want to identify that first because that's the most important thing. That's everything else in the argument is trying to convince us of that, right? So, but you can't just have a thesis. You also have to have support. So how is that claim supported? We can look at the rest of the argument and determine, okay, what are all the support structures for this claim? What are the reasons? What evidence they give? What are the facts, the statistics, examples, expert opinions, images, etc. And are those convincing? Do they relate to the thesis in a way that is enough to support the thesis? We can also ask what appeals besides logic are being used. So logic, the argument is based in logic, right? You have a thesis and you're supporting it with reasons. But that's not all that we're convinced by. We're also convinced by emotions, right? We're convinced by common ground. Maybe we have common ground with the argument. We're convinced by credibility, trustworthiness, and knowledgeability. So we can ask, like, what other things are being used here? We can also ask, are counter arguments acknowledged? So every argument can have a counter, right? You can disagree and you can counter it. And the appropriate thing to do is not to ignore the counter, but to acknowledge it and respond to it. So when you read somebody, when somebody gives you an argument, are they acknowledging that there are counter arguments? And are those counter arguments being represented accurately and respectfully? Are they misrepresenting the counters? Are they representing them properly? How are they dealing with their counters? Do they successfully refute their counters? How do they deal with the counters? Do they ignore them? Do they simply present them? How do they deal with the counters? You can also ask, what sources of information do they cite? So presumably they're citing sources of information to use as evidence. Are those sources presented? Are they cited? Do they seem like credible sources? And do they support the argument? Are they tangential? How are they used? And finally, do you detect any fallacies? So fallacies are faulty reasoning. So they're bad arguments. So do you think you find anything in there that is not reasoned correctly? So it's not, the question here is not whether or not the argument is giving true evidence, but does the conclusion follow from the evidence that's given? So if it does follow, then that's a good argument. That's not a fallacy. But if it doesn't follow, then they've made a mistake in their reasoning somewhere, a mistake in their logic. So they gave you some kind of reason, but their conclusion, what they're trying to argue for, doesn't follow from their reason. So did they make that kind of mistake anywhere?